What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of, you know what it is already, it's Form Check Friday. If you're looking at getting your videos submitted and critiqued on our wonderful series, go ahead and check the submission guidelines in the video linked in the description box below, and also make sure you check out the Calgary Barbell training app at calgarybarbell.programs.app. Now we're going to start off with what we left off with last week, which is Josh here doing some deadlifts. So now Josh said that he just wants to improve his deadlift. He says he feels it mostly in his back, and that he really struggles with finding a good position. And I think in the last video's comments, Josh was actually in there and was able to look through some of that stuff. He commented and said thank you to everybody who left him comments. And yeah, so I'm going to give my critique on things here today. And I think one of the things we're doing is we're not really pulling the slack out of the bar, right? So you're getting your hips into a good position. You're finding what we would normally, look at and say like, hey, that's a really good back position. But I think we're actually forcing almost a little bit too much extension. Now we do talk a lot about trying to get this extension, especially in this lower segment of the back, so that when we lock out, it's hip extension, right? Hips going from this to this, as opposed to the hips extending and the back still being, needing to be extended via this very lowest segment of the spine, which, is weaker than extending using these big muscles in your glutes. So that being said, I think we're actually overdoing this extension a little bit. If you're feeling it in your back, you might be well served to use a little more of a ribs down brace, right? Where you're thinking about taking your ribs, clamping them down on top of your abs, and using that as a sort of integral cue or part of your bracing strategy. Imagine your rib cage. We want to pull down with the lats. We want to pull down on top of the abs and try to tighten this space here as much as possible from both front and back. Now, in terms of pulling the slack out of the bar, what I'd like to see you do is set this back angle with your legs pretty much straight, right? With your butt way up in the air, pretty much like a stiff-legged sumo position. Set your back, and then I want you to tighten your back against the bar in terms of your lats and everything, and actually pull your hips down into position, right? You should be already starting to push the floor away as you pull your hips down into position, because right now we're getting into this position, and then by the time we start to lift, you'll see things change quite a bit. We kind of jerk into the bar. We go from this overextended position with the shoulders kind of shrugged up. We get the shoulders down. So we end up in a pretty good position, but I would like you to be in something more like this position before you start the lift. And by creating more tension against the bar before you actually make that effort to push it off the ground, then we're going to be more consistent from rep to rep. So good solid lockout. Also, make sure you keep your hands on the bar all the way to the ground, right? I don't know if you have any plans to compete or not, but if you ever did compete, that's red lights, man. Don't drop the bar. Now, that also doesn't mean you have to gingerly and gently set it down and not make noise and take advantage of the eccentric on the deadlift. That's not something I'm a huge proponent of, especially for powerlifting training. We don't need to really set it down. There is no eccentric portion of the lift in a competition. You basically just need to keep your hands on the bar all the way to the ground, right? So that's good practice as well. And let's take a look at this second rep. I think you do the same thing, right? You really set into this position. You're a bit forward, right? Like shoulder blades are a little bit out in front of the bar and knees are a little forward. And then when you go to pull, so let's take a look at this position here, and I'm going to just sort of roughly sketch it. See how we're a little bit more upright. The hips are a little further back, and the knees are definitely a little further back. This shin angle changes quite a bit. I'd like to see you more like the second position before you start the lift. And I think the best way to do that is by actually levering or pulling yourself down into position, as opposed to just sitting into position and then kind of yanking into the bar. So that's going to be my biggest advice there. Now for Anton, our next lifter, he says he's 23 years old. He's from Finland. He's lifted for about 2.5 years. He says he would like to compete in the future, but he says he's hit a wall in his squat. He hasn't progressed much in the past year to year and a half. He says right after he squats, he often gets a fair bit of low back stiffness. He says he knows his depth could be improved, and he feels his hips rise a little bit out of the hole. So honestly, man, if you're considering competing, just get depth. right? Don't squat knowing your depth could be improved. Just squat to depth, right? Like if you know it should be fixed, fix it, basically. A little bit of tough love there. But honestly, sometimes stopping your squats high or, rebounding from a high position can be a little like weirdly taxing on the body. It might be that, there's something in that pattern that's causing your back to tighten up a little bit. Tough to say. Generally speaking, getting a little bit more depth will allow you to go through a bit more of a full range of motion. And also, if we're squatting high all the time, it might be that we're overloading our squat. We might be doing just a little bit too much work because we're using a shortened range of motion. So if we bring that weight down, we get good full depth on every rep, we might see that back more and better able to adapt to the demands placed on it as we move forward with our training. In terms of the lack of progression, it might be that you need to, work on your movement pattern. It might be that once you start squatting to depth, you're going to see better progression. But it might also just be that you need to practice more with the squat. I would absolutely look at getting a coach. You could go to calgarybarbell.com and check out our coaching services there. You could use the Calgary Barbell training app. But a lot of the times programming is going to be one of the biggest reasons that people plateau, right? It's not very often that we'll change somebody's technique and it will, using the exact same training stimulus, things will skyrocket in terms of strength gains. More often than not, there are probably some changes that need to be made to your programming in terms of frequency, intensity, volume, those kinds of things that are going to be more responsible for your lack of progress than any sort of, technical issue. So, number one, squat to depth. Number two, look at your training. I think honestly, without seeing you squat to depth, this is kind of tough to diagnose. Things look mostly good. Is the crux of it, right? Like without seeing you go to depth, I don't know if you break down more. And if this was a to depth squat, I would say you're great, you're doing great, just keep doing what you're doing. But I don't know what kind of variables in terms of movement are going to be introduced when we go that little bit lower. So I would say that is number one priority, absolutely top level priority to get to a good competition depth. So that would be what I would work on first and foremost, and then re-diagnose and see if any movement issues crop up as a result of that. All right, up next we have Erik doing some bench press. So Erik is a pretty young lifter. He said he just started with a high school powerlifting team. He is a 114-pound competitor, so he's a pretty light guy. He says he's got some inconsistencies in the bench. Now he says he's not sure if it's strength or technique, but this is 165 for 2. So, I mean, strength and technique are almost inseparable when we get to powerlifting, right? Because there are coordination and strength demands are very much one and the same. And as soon as you alter the sort of external load, as soon as you go up in weight, there are higher demands on both strength and coordination. So you don't really separate those and say like, oh, we need to do coordination training. It's like, no, you need to practice training, this lift with an adequate intensity. That's the number one thing. So that being said, let's take a look at the lift here. So it looks like a pretty good setup. It looks like you're getting into a decent position. You're keeping your chest up out of the rack here. Now, really heavy touch, right? As a power lifter, one of the things we're going to want to do is not bounce off the chest. We're going to want to try to create like a nice tight isometric contraction on the chest where the bar is actually going to be paused on your chest. We don't want that bar to be bouncing off your chest, because one of the things we really need to work on coordinating when it comes to the competition bench press is the ability to pause on the chest and press on command. So if you're removing that variable from the equation, that's an element of this strength coordination sort of matrix that you're not training. And the only way to get better at stuff is by training it. So just like I was talking about with the last guy with depth, we really need to work on our touch. We really need to work on our control. And I don't know if this is like a normal training session for you, but I would say this is a 10 RPE. And you probably don't want to be hitting 10 RPEs very often in training. I think you'd have vastly more productive training in the 7 to 9 RPE range. Some are going to argue that you should never go over a 5 or whatever is in favor right now. But yeah, we want to lift heavy because not only is lifting heavy fun, but it's effective. But we don't want to be like grinding out reps and producing these repeated technical errors where we're, dumping the bar and bouncing it off the chest and those kinds of things. So I do think there's a fair bit of tightness to be had here in terms of how you're touching, right? Like I said, we want to be able to build an isometric contraction. We want to be in control all the way through the range of motion. We want a nice light touch on the chest, pause, and press, right? What's happening here is we're dumping into the chest, it's bouncing, and then we're coming back up. So that would be the sort of route I would go in terms of trying to improve your bench. I hope that helps, Eric. Okay, this is Wei. Now, Wei has been powerlifting for 2 years. He says he's struggling across all 3 lifts. His PR is 150, and in this video, he says this is 130 kilos. So he's wondering if this is a flexibility issue. And again, flexibility, mobility, coordination, strength, like all these things are very sort of inextricably linked, such that the best way to improve at this stuff is to practice it. I cannot stress that enough. We need to practice lifting as a skill, right? We can't separate out and go, do 3 different stretches and come back and all of a sudden you can deadlift better, or all of a sudden you can squat better. You need to perform the movement under load with the same external demands that are imposed on you in the lift in order to improve at the lift, right? That's why there's sort of a running joke on our live stream that my advice 9 times out of 10 is just do it better. Right? It's not, let's go do some weird little clamshell exercise with a band that's going to give you 1.5 pounds of resistance, because what the hell does that do for you when you're under 120 or 140 kilos in a squat, right? Where's that transference? I would argue there's probably not a lot of it. So what I'm getting at here is that all of these lifts are skills. We need to practice our skills. Strength is a skill. This practice is specific to being under load. So worrying about flexibility as this sort of like far off, very different point, not necessarily the most useful thing. The proxy for that within this framework would be, okay, starting position. And I think that is one thing that we can work on here. Wait. So getting back to your video, I think that we're a little bit forward over the bar. I think that you can pull yourself down and back into position a little bit more. We could maybe try to get a little bit more extension, but I do honestly think just pivoting your weight back a little bit is going to help put you in a better position. So perhaps widening your feet if you're feeling restricted in terms of what kind of position you can get into. A lot of the times if we're really narrow, everything kind of gets crowded in. So widening that stance can allow you to kind of open up a little bit. But yeah, just pivot everything back on your heels a little bit. The shoulder blade, try to get it just pulled down a little bit and just pivot, and try to maintain a little bit more contraction in the upper back. So as you start off the floor, we're seeing more tension or more flexion out of the upper back, right? We start in this position, and then as we start to pull, we kind of lose more here. We don't really want to be seeing a whole lot of shifting, especially in the upper back. We should be pretty consistent and solid here. Even a flex back, a deadlifter is gonna probably only round a little bit in this region, and ideally that flexion is going to be pretty static, because we want the length of the spine to be essentially locked in as a lever pivoting off of the hips or hinging off of the hips. We don't necessarily want to be seeing a whole lot of movement through the trunk and the spine, because those extensors are not as strong as your hips. So we want to bias most of the work to the hips. So everything back a little bit, try to get those shoulder blades down, and keep this segment, keep your bracing locked as you go through the lift. But other than that, I think you're doing a pretty damn good job. Like the movement, the timing, a lot of those kinds of things are very much on point. All right, up next is another Erik. So Erik just started back to squatting post-lockdown, and he says that he's rushing these reps and that he's really upset by his butt wink. So the first thing I'm going to say, Eric, is that you don't really have anything that would tell me that there's an issue with your bottom position. There is a little bit of movement in your back because you're relatively extended, and then when you get to the bottom, you're in a very neutral position. So I think you're just overthinking it. Like, look at how neutral and flat that is. Even using the model and presupposing or assuming that a flat back is somehow ideal and that a degree of flexion is a bad thing, which I do not subscribe to, you're really not messing anything up here, man. I think that what you're doing is you're potentially hyper analyzing these things, and I understand that what I do here probably contributes to people over analyzing things, and I recognize that, and I try to do my best to give a balanced concept of, you know, we want to strive for perfection, not be pissed off if we're not perfect, if that makes sense. I think I saw that on an Instagram motivational meme the other day. But basically, like, this is a totally fine back position, and don't beat yourself up over how your squat looks. The only thing I'm seeing is maybe we can bring those toes in a little bit. We're pretty toed out right now, so we might be falling a little forward in the bottom. And I think if you bring your toes in a little bit more, like instead of being toed out here, bring your toes in a little more forward pointing, and just work on controlling that bottom position more, right? Like this rep, we kind of fall forward a little bit in the bottom. We're kind of bouncing around a little bit. I'm not sure if it's paused or if that's a comp rep. So we just have to work on being more consistent in the bottom position. But like, dude, you're not messing anything up. You don't have like this big hideous low back movement that you should be afraid of, or that is sabotaging your progress or anything like that. Really and truly, I think this is a totally acceptable squat, barring maybe some looseness in the bottom position. That would be the one cue that I would give you, is to try to work on not popping forward quite so much in the bottom. And I think, you know, beyond that, you're looking totally fine, and this looks just fine to me. So there's a quick lesson for everybody. Try not to overthink things. Sometimes things are just fine and they don't really need to be changed. We just need to practice them, become consistent, and see more repeatable technique. All right. Up next is George doing some bench press, and so George is a lucky guy, I guess. Here, we reviewed his squat form last year on the channel, so he said thank you for that at the beginning, and you're very welcome, George. Hopefully it helped your squat. This is his third set of 4, and he recently widened his grip. There we go. You know, I tell people all the time to widen their grip. He says he finds less elbow pressure and less elbow pain with a bit of a wider grip. So the biggest thing George was asking about or wondering about was his setup and his hand position. So he's wondering more or less, like, you know, how does this grip width look? How is his wrist angle looking? And with his setup process being what it is here, you know, what we kind of think of how he's doing that. So we're actually going to leave this video to play one more time, and I'm going to sign off here. Again, if you're interested in having your videos critiqued, go ahead and check out the submission guidelines in the description box below. Head to calgarybarbell.com. We do have, as you can see here, some new merch coming, and maybe we saw here, but maybe not. So we'll have some news about that. We got our coaching services on there, and make sure to check out our training app and program library at calgarybarbell.programs.app. We'll see y'all next week. Bye-bye.